Singapore should not exist the way it does today, a tiny island with no oil, no gold, and no farmland. At independence in 1965, its neighbors thought it would fail. One British official called it an economic improbability. That was generous. It was poor, crowded, and divided, with exploding unemployment and a military that barely existed. And it had just been kicked out of Malaysia. Not left, kicked out. Today, Singapore is one of the richest countries on Earth. Its passport is among the strongest, and its airport feels like it was designed for the future. Somehow, this tiny island with no natural resources became richer per person than countries sitting on oceans of oil. Which raises a question. If the old story was that countries get rich from stuff like oil and coal, and Singapore had none of it, then what actually makes a country wealthy? Because it appears Singapore won. Or at least, it seems that way. Because underneath the polished skyline and immaculate subway system is a far more complicated story. One involving fear, control, global finance, cheap labor, massive state intervention, and a government that treated the entire country almost like a corporation. Singapore didn't accidentally become rich, it was engineered, and the blueprint changed the global economy forever. The story really begins with a man crying on television. August 9, 1965. Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's founding prime minister, sits before reporters announcing that Singapore has separated from Malaysia. At one point, he pauses. His voice cracks. He removes his glasses and wipes tears from his face. Because he understood what most people watching did not. Singapore was now alone. No natural resources, no military protection, no hinterland, no guarantee of survival. The country imported even its drinking water from Malaysia. Think about how fragile that is. Your entire nation survives at the mercy of another country turning a valve. This was not the setup for an economic miracle. This was the setup for collapse. But Lee Kuan Yew had a different idea. If Singapore could not compete on resources, it would compete on efficiency. If it could not be big, it would become indispensable. And this is where Singapore's strategy becomes fascinating. Most countries spend decades arguing about ideology, capitalism versus socialism, free markets versus state control. Singapore looked at this debate and essentially said, why not both? The government remained deeply involved in the economy. But unlike many state-led economies, it obsessed over competence. Not popularity, not ideology. Competence, and sometimes brutal pragmatism. One of the first things Singapore did was aggressively attract foreign companies, especially American manufacturers. Now this sounds normal today. But in the 1960s, many newly independent countries distrusted multinational corporations. They saw them as extensions of colonialism. Singapore saw them as customers. That distinction mattered. Lee Kuan Yew understood something many leaders missed. Poor countries do not become rich by isolating themselves from global capital. They become rich by making global capital feel safe. So Singapore built ports, industrial zones, reliable electricity, efficient customs systems, and most importantly, trust. No coups, no hyperinflation, no sudden nationalizations, no revolutionary chaos. For international corporations in the Cold War era, this was incredibly attractive, especially in Asia. By the 1970s, electronics manufacturers started pouring in. Texas Instruments, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric. Factories appeared almost overnight. Workers who once lived in slums suddenly found industrial jobs. And this is where the Singapore story becomes less romantic and more mechanical. Because Singapore's rise was not built on some magical cultural secret. It was built on positioning itself as the perfect machine for global trade. Efficient workers, low corruption, predictable laws, strategic geography. Look at a map. Singapore sits near the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important shipping routes on Earth. It turned geography into leverage. Its port became one of the busiest in the world, quietly siphoning value from everything moving through it. Singapore became obsessed with eliminating friction. Less paperwork, faster approvals, cleaner logistics. It treated inefficiency like a national enemy. But efficiency alone doesn't explain the scale of Singapore's wealth. Lots of countries built ports. Lots of countries welcomed foreign investment. Very few became Singapore. The real turning point came when Singapore realized manufacturing alone would eventually hit a ceiling. Cheap labor is a dangerous advantage, because eventually another country becomes cheaper. First it was Taiwan, then China, then Vietnam, then Bangladesh. There is always someone willing to manufacture t-shirts for less. Singapore understood this early. From low-end manufacturing, to advanced electronics, to petrochemicals, to finance, to wealth management, to high-tech services. Each step moved Singapore closer to the center of global money flows. Singapore is not just a successful economy, it is arguably one of the best-run financial machines in human history. Quietly, discreetly. Today, it manages trillions of dollars. The country built an image of extreme reliability. Because money is cowardly, it runs from uncertainty. Singapore offered the opposite: strong courts, stable currency, predictable government. In a world full of instability, predictability becomes a luxury product. But Singapore's government didn't just regulate the economy, it owned huge parts of it. Through sovereign wealth funds like Temasek and GIC, the state became a major shareholder in everything from airlines to banking. According to economic narratives, this shouldn't work. But Singapore's state institutions operated with ruthless efficiency. The state behaved less like a political machine and more like a long-term investment manager. Pragmatism over ideology. But this system came with trade-offs. Serious ones. Singapore is wealthy, but it is also intensely controlled. Speech restrictions, strict laws, heavy surveillance, limited political opposition. Chewing gum became internationally famous because of the ban, but honestly, that barely scratches the surface. Singapore's government believed disorder could destroy the country. And to understand why, you have to remember how vulnerable Singapore felt at independence. Tiny country, no resources, surrounded by uncertainty. For Singapore's leaders, stability was not a philosophical preference. It was survival strategy. The result is a country that sometimes feels less like a nation-state and more like a meticulously managed operating system. Clean, efficient, safe, but tightly calibrated. And then there's the housing system. This part shocks many outsiders. Roughly 80% of Singapore's population lives in public housing. Public housing, in one of the richest capitalist economies on Earth. Again, Singapore ignores ideological categories. The government massively intervened in housing because it feared social instability. And economically, it worked. Home ownership increased, slums disappeared, social cohesion improved. But there's an uncomfortable detail. Most Singaporeans do not truly own their homes in the way many people imagine. Technically, many are long-term leases from the government, 99 years, which means the state still quietly sits underneath the system, always. This pattern repeats in Singapore. Free markets on the surface, deep state control underneath. For decades, the formula produced extraordinary results. But Singapore's success carries hidden costs, starting with inequality. Luxury skyscrapers tower over migrant worker dormitories. Much of the infrastructure relies on imported labor from poorer Asian countries, living in conditions far from the glossy image foreigners see. Every polished financial hub has a basement somewhere. But there's a cost. Singapore is one of the world's most expensive cities. The country optimized for economic survival so successfully that life itself became highly optimized. Competition is relentless. Even childhood can feel like preparation for an exam that never ends. And beneath this sits a bigger question. Can Singapore remain indispensable? Its model depends on globalization, but the world is becoming less stable. Singapore has spent decades carefully balancing between major powers. But balancing becomes harder when the giants stop cooperating. And there's another issue. The very advantages that made Singapore rich are becoming more competitive. Other countries learned from the playbook: build infrastructure, reduce corruption, attract capital, develop finance sectors. Singapore still has advantages, huge ones. But maintaining exceptionalism is harder than achieving it once, especially when the world starts copying your homework. And yet, the deeper lesson of Singapore is not that every country should become Singapore. Most countries can't. Singapore is unusually small, strategically located, historically unique. Its model depends on conditions difficult to replicate elsewhere. The real lesson is more unsettling. Natural resources may matter far less than institutional competence. And that idea changes everything. Because if wealth is mostly about governance, trust, infrastructure, and long-term planning, then many countries are poor not because they lack resources, but because their systems leak value constantly. Corruption, instability, inefficiency, short-term politics. Singapore treated those problems almost like engineering failures, and for decades, the results were extraordinary. But history shows no model is invincible. As the world enters a new transition, driven by AI and deglobalization, the next era may reward completely different strengths. And that raises the final question. Did Singapore discover the future of capitalism? Or perfect the final version of a world that is quietly disappearing? Like, share, and subscribe for more interesting videos.